One of the biggest aspects of Subnautica is its sense of loneliness. From the moment you land to the moment you leave, it's just you, your thoughts, and well, maybe a couple of pet fish if you're lucky. But of course, this very nearly wasn't the case, and right after the crash, there were a dozen others, spread across 8 different lifepods, who were all also doing their best to survive. However, after visiting all of these lifepods in-game, it becomes pretty clear that some of these folks had it quite a bit better than others. But that begs the question, of the 9 lifepod crews, including the player, who actually had it the worst? Who had it the best? Were there some people who made it farther or less far than they probably should have, and how might some of them have been able to potentially survive? That's what I wanted to find out. So today, we're going to take a look at each lifepod situation, what they all went through, and rank them by how screwed they were in order to find out. Starting off with the person who I think probably had it the least bad, we have Second Officer Keen of Lifepod 19. Keen had a lot of things going for him after the crash, but his biggest advantage was easily geography. The lifepod he was in landed right in the middle of the sparse reef, a biome with 0 large predators and thus nothing that could really hurt him, save for a stray tiger plant or the occasional bleeder. Being in the sparse reef, he was also by far the closest person to the floating island, the group's designated rendezvous point. A point that, being second in command, Keen would have known about right away, having received it directly from the captain before his passing. So he was not only right next to where he needed to be, but he also immediately knew where he was going. Really, the only thing you can point to and say was somewhat bad about Keen's situation was the depth. At just under 300 meters down, Lifepod 19 is the game's second deepest by a pretty comfortable margin. A swim from here wouldn't have been easy, but still plenty doable with a bit of equipment. And what's more, after looking into things a bit further, I think there's a decent chance he might not have had to swim from that depth at all. You see, we know Keen got the coordinates for the rendezvous point basically immediately, and after taking a quick moment to send those out, there really wasn't anything preventing him from leaving. We do find one more PDA from Keen that was written after this point, but we know from the rendezvous voice log that you can remotely transfer data to an existing PDA. In fact, Keen is literally the one that does it, so there's no reason he couldn't have just left the PDA down there and typed everything out once he reached the floating island. There's also a line in the PDA itself that I think holds some weight. In it, Keen directly mentions being forced to evacuate. Now, given how secluded the sparse reef is, it seems pretty unlikely that this was from a creature, so if it wasn't that, then what was it? Well, if you take a look at where the lifepod is, you'll notice it actually sits under a ledge, meaning it didn't fall here directly, but probably bounced off a cliff or two on the way down. This would have slowed the lifepod's descent, giving Keen some extra time to send out the coordinates, but given all the dents in the lifepod, it also seems to have done some damage. If one of these impacts broke the hatch or damaged the hull enough to cause a leak, it would have forced Keen to evacuate long before the pod reached the bottom, inadvertently giving him a much easier swim as a result. Either way, it seems like Keen didn't have too much trouble with the swim, as he was one of the 3 people to actually reach the floating island, and this combined with a pretty great starting location is what earned him lowest on the list. Up next is Lifepod 3 and its 2 unnamed crew. This is probably the first lifepod that most players will find, and it's the one that seems to come to mind when thinking about people that could have made it. It's the shallowest non-floating lifepod in the game, so getting up to the surface wouldn't have been an issue, and being in the kelp forest, they definitely had one of the safer landing spots. Being in the northwestern kelp forest, they were actually around 3 times closer to the mountain island than the floating one, had they only known it was there. But even though they had to go a lot further than Keen, the actual waters between them and the floating island still weren't all that dangerous. In fact, the only reason these 2 didn't survive was very likely their own doing. Because they never really went outside to take stock of their surroundings, the pair actually overestimated the threats they'd be facing. Thinking the path ahead would be riddled with fast, dangerous fauna, where in reality it was just a few stalkers, the pair attempted to fix their emergency sea glide and hook it up to a power cell, with the hopes of it carrying them both to safety. This was a big risk, and the pair knew it. As one of them mentioned, the Sea Glide could just overload and break immediately. But not wanting to take the risk of going outside to get more supplies, it's a plan they nevertheless went with. Unfortunately, it's heavily implied by the mangled remains of a nearby Sea Glide that their gamble didn't pay off, and this seems to be the most likely explanation for how the pair died. Had they been a bit more willing to venture outside, they might have been able to get some more resources, or simply realized that the stalkers weren't all that big of a threat. This might have given them the confidence to try and make another Sea Glide, or even gone without one altogether. And had that happened, there really wasn't anything stopping them from making it to the floating island. Ultimately, I still have to put Lifepod 3 a bit above Lifepod 19, since unlike Keen, who didn't face any large predators, the bear still would have had to deal with a few stalkers, along with just having a much longer trip in general, but had any number of things gone different for them, it's very likely they would have survived. You might be a bit surprised that I don't have Lifepod 5 at the bottom of the list. I mean, the player's literally the one guy who actually goes on to survive this whole thing, so surely he had it far better than anyone else, right? Well, while he certainly had it better than a decent chunk of people, I don't think he quite had it the best, and there's a couple of reasons why. For one thing, it's quite easy to overlook just how close Riley was to not even waking up in the first place. Of the 9 Lifepods, Lifepod 5 is the only one we know of to catch fire, at least of its own accord, but I'll get to that whole incident shortly. And with such a large fire in such a small space, I probably don't have to tell you just how dangerous that can be. Also, bear in mind that all of this was happening while Riley was knocked unconscious. So if anything had gone just slightly different, say the fire starting earlier, spreading slightly faster, or maybe that minor head trauma being a little less minor and keeping Riley knocked out for longer, it's very likely the player would have either burned or died from smoke inhalation long before waking up. Another, much more subtle way Riley got screwed was that his radio broke in the crash, preventing him from receiving, but even more importantly, sending distress calls. While he was pretty much out of it until everyone else was dead, had his Lifepod been able to send an automated distress call, it could have led to one of the other survivors finding the Lifepod, since we do know of at least one other person who passed in his general vicinity. And from there, they could have put out the fire, resuscitated the player, and ultimately teamed up with him, which would have made things a lot easier. Still, I have to give his situation some credit, because after putting out the fire, repairing the radio, and getting his bearings, Riley was easily in the best position. He had a fully functioning, floating Lifepod in the middle of the safe shallows, keeping him safe from radiation, warpers, and other nasty things, and this allowed him a lot more time to get acquainted with the world and slowly build up his gear, so once the time came, he could safely head deeper. The story of Lifepod 6, home to an unnamed crew member from HR and one of the Aurora's 9 passengers, is definitely one of the more interesting ones. It's pretty widely assumed that only Lifepods 4 and 5 remained afloat after the crash, because, they're the only ones we find that actually float, but I think there's also a very strong case to be made for Lifepod 6. In the final voice log, the passenger is apparently waving around a flare to try and hopefully attract someone's attention. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think waving around a flare inside of a Lifepod that's over 100 meters down would do much good at attracting much of anything. What she was almost certainly doing was poking her head out the top hatch and waving around the flare from there, and for that to be both possible and practical, the Lifepod would have to be, well, floating. Assuming this is the case, it makes one of the other oddities about their situation start to make a bit more sense. In the original distress call and the first crew log, the lady from HR, who I will now refer to as HR Lady, mentions there being radiation between them and the rendezvous. In their current position in the grassy plateaus, this statement makes no sense. At the start of the game, there's no radiation blocking their path, and there wouldn't be until multiple hours after the Aurora exploded, by which time everyone but the player was already long dead. So unless the PDA was just feeding them bad data, which seems pretty unlikely, the only way their path could have been blocked is if they'd landed a lot further to the northeast, potentially as far up as the bulb zone. Then, because it was still floating, the lifepod simply drifted southeast over the next few hours, eventually ending up where we find it today. For the pair, staying on the surface would have been both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, there was no risk of drowning or getting stuck. On the other hand, since the pair wanted to make radiation suits to get through all that radiation, it meant they'd have to dive all the way down to the seafloor in order to get some lead. Or at least HR lady would. At this point, the passenger was too scared, arrogant, and generally incompetent to do much of anything. So, in what might just be the single most underrated feat from any of the survivors, HR lady managed to dive down. Mind you, they were still likely in the bulb zone at this point, get at least one piece of lead, and make it back to the lifepod without dying. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, this is some super impressive stuff. So why are they so low on the list? Well, there's just one problem. All of this could have been avoided had they simply just gone around the radiation. It would not have added much to their trip, it would have saved them loads of time, they would have known if they were in any danger, since judging by the player, everyone seems to have built-in radiation detectors, and by leaving right away, the passenger wouldn't have had a chance to be dumb and get them killed with a flare. Yes, that's how they die. A flare catches a fuel line of an electrically powered lifepod, don't ask me how that one works, and they both go boom. Man, HR lady really did all that work for nothing. The sad part is, had they just waited and left at the very end, they'd have been totally fine. They'd drifted so far at this point, their path was completely clear. Alas, they didn't know exactly where the radiation was, so I guess I can't fault them there. And had they made radiation suits, there's a non-zero chance they would have strayed too close to the Aurora and ended up getting yoinked by a Reaper. But had it not been for some pretty horrendous stupidity on the part of the passenger, they too would have likely survived. The fates of the next two lifepods are actually pretty similar, but in terms of who had it less bad, I'm gonna go with Lifepod 17, home to everyone's favorite cafeteria worker, Ozzy. Ozzy's bad luck started before he even hit the water, nearly having his pod crushed by the Seamoth Bay on the way down. Perhaps because of this, the lifepod's flotation devices completely failed to deploy, and a few moments later, the pod was 91 meters down in the southwestern grassy plateaus. This on its own probably wasn't horrible. I mean, Keen landed almost 3 times further down and he was fine. But unlike Keen, who landed in the quiet safety of the sparse reef, Ozzy was in the sand-shark-ridden grassy plateaus, and most consequentially, right next to the jelly shroom caves. At this point, Ozzy probably should have started gearing up to leave right away. The sand sharks might have still gotten him, but if he'd managed to get up fast enough, he'd be well out of their reach. Unfortunately, our friend Ozzy didn't really want to go outside. Can't say I blame him, but in doing so, it gave some time for his lifepod to attract some unwanted attention. In this case, a crab snake, which somehow got mad enough to come all the way out of the cave and start eating through the lifepod's hull. And from there really wasn't much poor Ozzy could do. He sent out his distress call around this time, and the opening on the hatch suggests he might have tried to bail out as a last resort, but it clearly wasn't meant to be, and he was likely eaten once the crab snake got inside. Real quick, if you're enjoying the video and want to help me out, consider subscribing. I'd love to try and hit 100k by the end of the year, and if even a small percentage of you were to hit that button, we could actually make a pretty decent bit of headway. Anyway, back to what you actually came here to see. As said, Lifepod 7 was in a really similar position to Lifepod 17, and had it not been for a singular, absolutely atrocious piece of luck, the crewmen inside would have likely made it out. In terms of geography, the Lifepod was actually the second closest to the floating island, only after Lifepod 19. But just like Ozzy, who had to put up with crab snakes and sand sharks, this guy had to deal with his own collection of hungry carnivorous life forms, that collection being a metric ton of bone sharks. Now, this alone probably wouldn't have been the end for the poor fella. There were several lifepods that landed far deeper, 2 of which did have people make it back up, and while bone sharks can be a bit of a pain, they're by no means unsurvivable, especially with something like an air bladder or a sea glide to increase your mobility. And to this guy's credit, he wasn't planning to just sit around and wait for rescue. The pod evidently had a decent amount of materials, and he fully intended to use them, build some equipment, and head for the surface. But that's when he ran into a pretty big problem. Maybe it was because of damage from the crash, or Altera's seemingly subpar lifepod maintenance, we'll likely never know for sure, but whatever the cause, the analysis circuits on the Lifepod's fabricator were completely fried, effectively randomizing what it would craft. Again, to his credit, the guy didn't give up. He sent out a distress call and kept trying to craft stuff with trial and error. But, being so deep in the crag field, it was only a matter of time before a group of bone sharks got curious and started attacking the Lifepod, most likely killing the guy long before he had a chance to make anything useful. In terms of what it would have taken for this guy to not die, I think there are two potential solutions. The first would have been to try and avoid getting stuck on the ocean floor in the first place. Being so close to the rendezvous, the guy could have conceivably bailed as soon as his lifepod hit the water, and made the swim with minimal equipment. However, if he hadn't got the coordinates yet, I can see where that really wouldn't work. The other way would have been to just swim for the surface anyway. With no equipment, it would have been a last resort for sure, but when I tested it in-game, it was just about possible. So, assuming this guy had a similar level of speed and endurance as the player, and of course that the bone sharks didn't mess with him too much, he might have actually made it up. If there's one lifepod I certainly wouldn't have wanted to try and swim from though, it would be Lifepod 2. Home to Engineer Berkeley and Chief Technical Officer Yu, like the vast majority of the lifepods, their flotation devices completely failed. But unlike everyone else, they also had to deal with some flooding. This nearly forced them to evacuate right away, where they'd have then been forced to swim a good 2 kilometers with no equipment just to reach the floating island. Luckily, Yu managed to reconfigure the Lifepod's O2 system to act as a bilge pump, but while it certainly saved them in the moment, this action came with 2 new problems. Because they'd opted to stay in the Lifepod, the pair quickly found themselves 500 meters down in the northern blood kelp, a place filled to the brim with warpers, crab squids, ampules, and other not-so-nice things. Also, since you had to modify the O2 system, it meant they only had enough air for the next half hour. Although, depending on how you want to look at things, this second part might have actually been a blessing in disguise. Whereas some of the other crews opted to wait for a rescue that ultimately never came, potentially missing out on windows where they could have actually escaped, Yu and Berkeley didn't have that option. They were essentially forced to find a way back up no matter the cost. And this was ultimately good for the pair, because had they stayed, well, just take your pick for what would have eventually broken in and killed them. Anyway, they seem to have had a decent number of resources, given all the gear they'd have had to make, and after a while it would have come time to leave. From here, it's a bit unclear as to what all happened. We know Yu eventually made it to the floating island, so she obviously survived, but Berkeley is nowhere to be seen. Maybe there was only enough gear for one of them, and Berkeley opted to stay behind, but I think the much more likely explanation is that, about 200 meters up, they had the displeasure of running into an adult ghost leviathan, and I think we can all figure out what happened from there. While getting turned into a human creature decoy probably wasn't the best thing to ever happen to Berkeley, his sacrifice is more than likely what gave Yu enough time to make it to the surface and eventually reach the floating island. Which, compared to a lot of the other crew deaths, is actually pretty dang heroic. Good on you, Berkeley. Ultimately, this lifepod earns the number 3 spot because while the situation itself is easily the worst we've seen so far, the lifepod's seemingly high amount of resources and lack of any major mechanical failures gave at least one of the crew a legitimate shot at making it out. The same can't be said about Lifepod 2. At a brief glance, and I mean a very brief glance, things don't seem like they'd have been all that bad. The Lifepod was one of just 3 to stay afloat, there appear to have been a decent number of resources on board, since the guy was able to make both radiation protection and creature decoys, and the singular crewman himself seems to have been at least reasonably competent, unlike some other folks. Unfortunately, landing in the middle of the crash zone meant that he was pretty much doomed from the start. Within just a few minutes, the Lifepod was already being attacked by not one, but multiple Reaper Leviathans, with one of them trying to swallow the Lifepod, and another even getting close enough for long enough to be scanned. To make matters worse, the lifepod was also well within the Aurora's radiation zone, causing the crewmen to need to spend precious resources making a radiation suit, and meaning that even if someone else had survived and tried to rescue him, they likely wouldn't have even been able to get to him. At this point, the only course of action that seemed to make sense was to try and head for the relative safety of the Aurora itself, which the crewman actually went for. But unbeknownst to him, this mission was effectively a suicide run. Since the Aurora hadn't yet exploded, there was no way onto the ship at this point, and even if he had miraculously found one, he would have just died a few hours later in the Aurora explosion anyway. In fact, the explosion was so powerful that even if he'd somehow managed to hold out in the lifepod, he still would have been close enough to the ship to get killed in the blast. The only way I could have seen this guy surviving is maybe if he'd used the decoys and headed west. It's unlikely, but he might have been able to escape to the mushroom forest. Even then, he still wouldn't have been totally out of the woods, needing to make a fairly long swim with minimal equipment, but it at least would have given him a fighting chance. And finally, the person who I think had it the worst off is Medical Officer Danby in Lifepod 6. At first, Danby's situation doesn't actually seem too horrible. Yes, he landed down in the bulb zone, meaning he probably had the third worst starting location after Livepods 2 and 4. His path to the floating island was also the longest, stretching over 2.6 kilometers, and part of that was blocked by radiation, meaning he'd either have to build a radiation suit or take a detour and swim even farther. All of this was certainly bad, and if this was everything Danby had to deal with, it's likely he'd still be third or fourth on the list. Unfortunately for Danby, bone sharks and radiation were the least of his concerns, because he was dealing with something far, far worse. The Kara bacterium. Now, we know that all of the survivors were infected basically as soon as they left their respective lifepods, and we also know that the Kara seems to affect different people at different rates. The Degassi crew, for example, were able to make it about 2 months before showing any major symptoms, and the same seems mostly true for the player. Things were a bit worse for some of the crew on the Mercury 2, who had to be left behind after developing symptoms within what was likely a couple weeks, but for all of these people, the bacterium's incubation time was still in the realm of weeks to months, theoretically giving any of them at least a fighting chance at discovering a cure. Unfortunately, the same could not be said for Danby. Whether it was partially due to an injury he got after landing, or just entirely bad luck, Danby's infection progressed far faster than any other character we know of. And while other folks had multiple weeks or even months before falling ill, Danby began to show visible symptoms within just 3 hours. This is why Danby tops the list. With every other Lifepod crew, no matter how bad their situation, there's at least an argument that can be made for their survival. A series of hypothetical steps, no matter how counterintuitive or risky, that they could have taken in order to survive, or at least have a much better chance at doing so. But for Danby, you can't make that argument. He could have landed in a fully functional lifepod in the middle of the safe shallows, had all of the equipment in the world, and met up with every other remaining survivor, and none of it would have mattered. He got sick so fast, he was effectively a dead man from the moment he chose to leave that lifepod. And unlike every other person who crash-landed that day, there was nothing anyone could have done to save him. Well, I guess they could have got Frosty to come in and cure the entire world in 26 minutes. That might have worked.